Hi friends, Tracy here to tell you that making a podcast is hard work. There's research, scripts, editing, and all of that can mean a million decisions. Fortunately for me, my choice in a podcast hosting platform was easy because I decided upon Anchor by Spotify. If you haven't heard about Anchor by Spotify, it's the easiest way to make a podcast with everything you need all in one place. Let me explain. Anchor has tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. When hosting on Anchor, you can distribute your podcast on listening platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. And best of all, Anchor is totally free. Download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started on your podcast today. Crescent City Crime contains violent and explicit content that is not suitable for a younger audience. Certain topics may be disturbing or triggering to some listeners. Listen at your own risk. Thank you for supporting the podcast by listening to Crescent City Crime. Please help spread the word of the podcast by telling a friend about us. You may help further support the show by leaving us a 5-star review on your preferred podcasting platform. We are also on Patreon at Crescent City Crime. Check the episode description for source links, as well as links to our social media accounts. The music used in this introduction is called the Black Fingerprint, and it was composed by Dylan Owen. Welcome to Crescent City Crime, dear listeners. I'm Tracy.
And I'm Brian.
And Brian, we have quite an influx of new listeners right now. So welcome, new listeners. Welcome very much. Thank you for listening to us.
Yes, thank you for listening. Welcome to our podcast, and we really enjoy talking to you.
And for those who have been there and have been listening to us for a little while, welcome back.
Welcome.
So today's case took place in 1927, and right before we started recording, you were looking up some little 1920s factoids, weren't you?
Yeah, just refreshing my memory on a bunch of interesting things there. What I find to be most fascinating regarding our country then was that much of the stuff that we take for granted today was actually introduced during the 20s, like electricity, radio, motion pictures, women's suffrage. The right to vote. In other words, not the right for women to suffer, which
we do every day.
Yes.
Yes.
And there was, we had that period of, I guess you could say, turmoil that caused one of the greatest spikes in crime in all of history, called Prohibition.
Mm-hmm.
Which was it was basically an illusion. There was more alcohol going around during Prohibition than prior to Prohibition. It created it created a really insane illegal market.
And not only was it illegal to sell or drink, it was also illegal to manufacture, which meant that anybody could manufacture liquor. And of course, if it's not manufactured the right way, people get sick.
Alcohol poisoning.
Some people have gone blind from drinking liquor that was not made properly. Just FYI.
Yeah.
So if you, dear listeners, if you go into a liquor store and you pick up your favorite drink, whatever it might be, rest assured that it was made under the correct circumstances these days, and it will not blind you.
Yeah, FDA standards, and some regulation by ATF, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. But in the United States, there were some very interesting things going on that caused quite a bit of crime and violence. And even though this is after World War I, also known as the Great War, Western and Eastern Europe and parts of the Middle East and Africa, there were several regional wars and civil wars taking place too, as well as turmoil in the streets of Germany.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, people think that social media these days can be pretty vicious. The streets of Germany in the 1920s often erupted into violence between communists, capitalists, conservatives, socialists.
Mm-hmm.
Many of these fights would erupt out of a beer hall after people would get out of hand debating each other. And we had, most notably, we had Adolf Hitler's 1923 failed putsch, another name for a coup, when he and his, at the time, not, very, not too popular Nazi party attempted to overthrow the governments of Bavaria and Germany, in 1923, and it failed. That's how Hitler spent almost a year in jail.
So that is our 1920s picture, basically, that you painted for us.
Yes. It's an age. It is an age of economic prosperity, at least until 1929. But it was very eventful, and there were still a lot of terrible things going on.
Well, we're going to be talking about a terrible thing that happened in the city of New Orleans in the 1920s. Okay, so let's step into our Wayback Machine. And Brian, I want you to picture New Orleans in 1927. No interstates, no traffic. Like, there was probably hardly any cars. So people would use the St. Charles streetcar, right?
That's right.
Yes. Which is, I think we mentioned this before on the podcast, that is the antique streetcar that still is in service today. If the red streetcars are the modern ones, and the green streetcars is the St. Charles. That's the OG. I don't even think there's air conditioning.
The antiques, there isn't air conditioning, and the seats are made of wood.
Yes.
Same style as they were.
And you feel the vibrations all the way up through your body if you're sitting on those seats. Yeah.
And you do hear the noise.
You do hear the noise.
Which a good bit of it is from the wheels on the track.
Right. Now, Prohibition was law, but believe it or not, it was not as enforced in New Orleans. Sometimes the mic picks that up, so I have to edit that out. That's okay, though. So there was no public drinking in the streets of New Orleans, but that was kind of all that it was enforced. Now, how people were able to buy liquor, I don't know. How they manufacture it, I don't know. But one day we are going to get more into the Prohibition New Orleans topic on this podcast. But today we're going to be talking about the Moiety family. And this story, a reason why this story is even known today is because a woman named Lauren Delaney George found a Times-Picayune article from October the 28th of 1927. She found it filed away in a binder at the Williams Research Center of New Orleans, and she wrote her own article about it. So that's where a lot of this information is going to come from, is from that article and from Lauren Delaney George's research.
Wow. It's interesting.
The Moity family lived in the apartments on the top of 715 Ursuline Street in the French Quarter, and the family consisted of Henry and Joseph Moity. They were brothers, and they were married to, or each one of them were married to, Teresa and Leonide. Henry and Teresa had 3 small children, so it was a total of 7 people sharing that space. It's not clear how many rooms there were, but at one point Teresa and Henry separated, and she lived with Leonide and Joseph. The men worked menial jobs. They were dock workers. And Leonide and Teresa would bring in more income by taking sewing jobs. Now, Henry did not like that Leonide was influencing Teresa to stay away from him. So right off the bat, he sounds like a jerk. Now, this was a time where even if you had low wages, believe it or not, you could still afford domestic help. And it was on October the 27th of 1927 that the Moity's housekeeper, Nettie Compass, reported for duty at the apartment of the Moity family. When she entered the apartment that morning, she expected to have a normal day. Oh boy, did I butcher that. When Nettie Compass entered the apartment that morning, she expected to have a normal day, but instead found a scene of bloody disarray. She went to summon help, and two men came. One of them called the reporter George William Healy, and in his memoir, Healy described the discovery. He said, "We found red stains on the floor and saw a large trunk in a bedroom partially open. When I pulled up the trunk lid, a woman's body, arms, and legs severed from the torso was exposed."
Quite gruesome.
It gets even worse. Healy called his office and asked that another reporter come join them on the scene, and he said that it was appropriate to alert the coroner. When the coroner and another reporter named Gwen arrived, now I just want you to think about this today. When a crime scene happens, Brian, what goes on? Everything, right? They tape it off so people can't walk through the crime scene. You have technicians go in there to collect evidence, look for DNA, all that stuff, right?
Yeah, then, well, no, these days, and there's at least one detective working the scene, and in addition to taping off the scene, there's regular patrol officers who are posted on perimeter, which
Right.
simply means only let authorized people in, which means crime scene technicians, other police, detectives. That doesn't mean you're letting in the media, for example.
Well, the media got there before the cops did in this case because things were very different in the 1920s. And when little Miss Gwen, arrived in that apartment, she noticed some gruesome objects on a bed, which turned out to be severed fingers from a woman's hand. Gwen picked them up and put them back on the bed, by the way. Like, she was like, "Oh, what are these? Severed fingers." Oh, put them down.
I imagine it was a very surreal sight for her.
Yeah.
And that was her way of dealing with it. Oftentimes, when people see such gruesome things, the initial shock sets in where you're kind of pragmatic. Your
Right.
reaction is kind of pragmatic.
That just trips me out, though, that she picked up severed body parts.
Like, there was I saw this crime scene one time. I won't go into all the details here, where I saw footprints in blood.
Mm.
And thought very little of it. Just told myself, "Oh, blood, okay." And I saw the shell casings, and I'm thinking, "Okay, shell casings."
Right.
And it didn't fully add up until I saw an overturned bicycle and a pair of shoes, which had been kicked off for some reason. The individual wanted to run, thought he could run faster. The shoes with a pool of blood in one of the shoes.
Right.
Just for example, that's when, by that time, the reality had set in that there was a shooting right there, and the victim had run away.
Right.
So it can take a minute or two to really come to terms with this kind of stuff when you see it.
Yeah, but I don't know about picking up severed. I think I would just leave them there.
Imagine the effort that goes into severing limbs, severing the fingers.
A lot goes into that, but we're not even halfway done with this story.
Yeah. It's not like you might see it on some horror movie. This limbs and digits don't get severed that easily.
That's true. Now, Gwen moved into the next bedroom and she found another trunk, and it contained the body of a different woman. So there's two dead bodies in this apartment, both put into trunks. Resting on the torso of the second body was a bloodied cane knife, and this is the kind of knife they used to cut sugar cane with, so it's very sharp.
So that might be, apparently that'd be suitable for cutting bone.
Probably so.
Ligaments.
Now, the severed fingers belonged to Teresa Moiety. Her wedding ring was found in a gaping wound in her back. So it might have been like she was stabbed in the back and the killer put the wedding ring in her back, like in that open wound. Maybe.
That's pretty macabre there.
Isn't it, though? So, clumps of Teresa's hair covered the floor, and personal items such as children's clothing, unfinished sewing projects, lace garments, stockings, and beauty tools were flung about the room. Now, the original article mentioned that a manuscript written by Teresa was discovered in the cabinet of her bedroom. Now, you talk about women's suffrage, but what we don't really think about these days is that back then there was no divorce. That just didn't happen. Okay.
Yes.
So you had a lot of women who, and not just women, but men too, but I'm talking about women here, who were not ready for marriage, but they did it because it was what you were supposed to do. You had kids because that was expected of you. It's not like today where we have more choice in that arena. So in this manuscript, this was something that she submitted to a confession magazine. The manuscript was an autobiographical story that cautioned young girls to be careful, for marriage as a life sentence. The manuscript was rejected, and the rejection slip from her submission lay in a pool of her own blood. And, it took a lot of courage to acknowledge those feelings in that day and age and put them on paper. It really was, because this was not, at the time, that was a radical idea that a woman did not have to get married. It's not so radical these days, but it was radical back then. That was unheard of.
Self-expression was still suppressed by women back then too.
For women, not by women, but yeah.
Yeah. Well,
both. Yeah, both. Okay, you're right. So back then, you stayed with the person you're with no matter what, and the existence of many women was made more difficult by that expectation. And back then, like I said, there was no divorce. As the scene was processed, police could not locate Henry Moiety. Henry had worked as a butcher as well as a dock worker, and the Times-Picayune stated that the manner in which the two bodies of the women were mutilated and dismembered indicated a man familiar with this trade. Radio dispatches started departing steamer ships to be on the lookout for a passenger, and described Henry as tattooed and very hairy. So I guess he had like a lot of hair on his body.
On his, I would say, on his chest and arms.
Probably so. Maybe his back too. They eventually found Henry in Bayou Lafourche. His cover story was that the murders were committed by a red-headed Norwegian seafarer that had forced Henry to assist him in the murders.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. However, by Tuesday, November the 1st, Henry made a full confession, claiming sole responsibility for the murders of Teresa and Leonide. Now, the prison was very different in the 1920s, as we recently covered in our Angola episodes, okay? But anyone could come to visit you back then, and they could bring you anything. Well, maybe not anything, but they could bring you a lot of things, like whatever you asked for, like cigarettes or magazines,
a
whatever. Cake with a very suspicious file in it, so you could bring that
cigarettes.
Yes.
Cigars.
There were no metal detectors or pat downs. So while Henry occupied a New Orleans prison cell, he smoked cigarettes, he painted, and he talked to his visitors. He also discussed the details of his crimes. He had discovered that Teresa had a lover named Joseph Caruso. Caruso was also married and operated a real estate office from the ground floor of 715 Ursuline. It wasn't long after the Moitys moved in that Teresa and Caruso discovered each other. The November 2nd, 1927 Times-Picayune repeated portions of Henry's confession, in which he claims that Teresa and Caruso took friendly excursions on streetcars and flirted with each other. They hugged and passed notes, which sounds kind of sweet. It sounds like at least those two, Caruso and Teresa, liked each other at least. Then on Wednesday, October the 26th, Teresa and Leonide announced that they were planning to move out. According to a 1957 letter from a Louisiana State Penitentiary prison warden, so yes, Henry did go to Angola. he said that Teresa is alleged to have flaunted a $10 bill in Henry's face and bragged that she could make more in an hour as a prostitute than he could make in a week. Henry walked in on Teresa and Leonide packing their belongings into the two large trunks. A furious Henry started to drink, and while he was on his binge, he went to purchase the murder weapon. That night, after the Moities went to bed, Henry continued to drink, and in his confession to the district attorney, Henry said that he considered killing himself and the children, but he decided he didn't want Teresa running around with Joe Caruso and decided to kill her instead.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
So he had time to think about it. He admitted to that as well.
Yes, he thought about it.
Which makes him even more guilty.
Mm-hmm. Now, Henry stood over Teresa's sleeping body and swung like a madman. As he later recounted to the DA, she didn't say a word or move. She just relaxed and the blood rushed. After he killed Teresa, he went to Leonide's bedroom and struck her. She died instantly and her body fell out of the bed. Henry then severed the bodies of the women and packed their body parts into the trunks they had packed with their belongings just hours earlier. In March of 1928, Henry was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. He appealed for a pardon in 1941, which was rejected by the governor. And in 1944, he briefly escaped from the Louisiana State Penitentiary.
Wow.
Excluding his prison escape, the warden's 1957 letter also claimed that Henry was one of the best prisoners we've ever had.
So he was putting on an act while looking for an opportunity to escape, apparently.
Well, we're not done with that part of the story, because it gets even wilder. In spite of the brutal crime that he committed, Henry was named a trustee prisoner, which meant that he was allowed out of prison to go run errands. So in the 1920s, like, trustee prisoners could just waltz out of prison to go run errands.
So I take it his escape was simply not coming back from an errand?
More or less, yes.
Ooh.
So in the summer of 1944, 16 years after he started his sentence, he was assigned to go to the post office. While he was out, he hired a taxi to take him to Hammond, Louisiana. And from there, he boarded the Illinois Central Panama Limited. That's a train.
Yeah.
And went to Chicago.
Well, I mean, looking back at just how terrible an institution Angola is today, and it must have been pretty horrible back then, even worse.
Yes.
There's considerable incentive to escape if you become a trustee, if you gain their trust, which is why he was such a model prisoner. It was apparently part of his escape plan.
Maybe.
So I can't say I'd really blame anyone for trying to escape from Angola back then, if they just open the door for you and say, well, okay, go out and mail off this send off this mail, and
and this is probably why they don't just allow that today. You can't just let a prisoner go out of prison and say, hey, go to the post office for me, will you? And while you're at it, go to the gas station and get me a Sprite.
Well, I don't know if they had Sprite back then, but it would.
Or Coca-Cola.
He may have been sent to the gas station to get a soda or a pop.
A cold drink.
I don't think they said cold drink now. I think it was like pop or soda.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, in any case, the superintendent of the prison at the time, George Provosti, was not concerned about Henry's escape. He thought that Henry would come back on his own. But it would take 2 years until Henry was stopped for suspicious behavior by police in St. Louis, Missouri. When he admitted his identity, he was returned to prison in Louisiana, and in 1948, the Louisiana Pardon Board released him. So
even after he
escaped. So 21 years after the murders, Henry Moity was free.
That is ridiculous.
Until, hold on, not done yet. He moved to California and he lived there happily until 1956. He and his girlfriend, Alberta Orange, were enjoying a stay in a hotel room in Los Angeles until an argument ensued and Henry shot her in the chest and punctured her lung. She did survive the incident, but Henry was sentenced to 5 years at Folsom Prison for attempted murder and assault with a deadly weapon. Just a year after he was sentenced, he died in Folsom Prison of a stroke in 1957, and he was buried on the prison grounds.
All's well that ends well.
That's true.
Can't say he didn't deserve it.
Now, an interesting tidbit that I uncovered, even though I could not find the painting, is that he painted a portrait of former Louisiana Governor Huey P. Long, and it actually hung in the Baton Rouge Governor's Mansion for many years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so I don't know if that's still hanging in the Governor's Mansion or what, but yeah, at one point, at least in the state of Louisiana's history, a portrait of Huey P. Long, probably one of Louisiana's most famous governors, was painted by a felon, by a convicted murderer.
You could hardly make this stuff up.
Really. No, you really can't. And I promise I'm not making it up. It was just, this is such a bizarre case overall, is that you have a person who killed two women horribly. Horribly. I mean, he severed their limbs and their fingers and all that stuff, and tries to blame it on somebody who said that he fought the Norwegian seafarer that he made up. He said that this person forced him into assisting him to commit these murders.
Yeah, I'm sure the police didn't buy that at all.
No, I would really hope not. And well, I mean that's pretty much the end of the story. You know, everybody dies in the end.
Well, the woman he shot in the chest survived, though.
She did survive. You're right.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy. It seems you could say only in Louisiana do you have that type of lunacy. That lunacy go on. And also consider that was still at a time when even if you were a convicted felon, even if you had previously committed a capital offense and you were free, you were still not for you still had Second Amendment rights. You weren't forbidden from owning a firearm back then.
Mm-hmm.
During the 1920s, under those circumstances, that didn't actually happen until 1968. Believe it or not. So much was so different back then.
Yeah, and like you could, the thing that gets me is that you could just be sent on an errand if you were a trustee prisoner.
What also kind of gets me here is that was also a time where if you leave your home state where you have a criminal record, it was very difficult to track you.
Right.
If you stayed out of trouble, you could easily avoid being sent back to prison, especially if you stayed away from your home state where you were sentenced to prison.
Right.
But apparently this was not the type of individual who could
stay out of trouble.
Who could stay out of trouble, who could deal with society in his, in the time of his life as a reasonable and rational individual.
That's true. And I mean, he was on the loose for about 8 years? Well, if you count like the 2 years that he escaped from prison, so he had a decade of freedom after this.
Yeah, he did not stay in prison long enough to reform.
Well, I don't know if you can reform if you just willingly butcher two people.
Well, what I mean is find a different way to live your life.
Oh, right.
Okay, to have a different life. Apparently, yes. Once again, we're dealing with a psychopath here.
Mm-hmm.
Who has a warped, twisted view of reality. which of course they do.
Yes, and also very entitled. He very clearly was up. I mean, he's the type of person who wants to just control the women around him.
Yes, a consummate narcissist, misogynistic narcissist who felt that it was the purpose of women was to serve him however way he wishes. And it's good that you mentioned the word entitled, because he certainly did have a sense of entitlement, as every narcissist does.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, every crime committed, whether it's stealing a bag of potato chips on up to robbing a bank, committing a murder, every crime begins with a sense of entitlement. This mindset where you sell yourself on the idea that, well, I absolutely should do this, despite the fact that I know it is against the law, it's morally wrong, but I'm really entitled to have this. I'm entitled to do this. I should be allowed to do this. You see,
Right.
So that's that slippery that's that slippery slope you just jump off of when you decide to commit one of these crimes. But just like every crime begins with a sense of entitlement, every single one.
Yes, and I am very unhappy to report that the entitled narcissism of certain types of people, particularly men who want to hurt women, that's not changed in the last 100 years.
It's never going to change.
No, it's not.
Never going to change. No. You can have an abundance of economic prosperity, but that's not going to change certain people who always want more, who always feel like they're entitled
And
to have more, and will do anything, absolutely anything to get it.
That can make them worse, even. Economic abundance can make people like that even worse, because they're like, oh, I have money. What you going to do to me?
Yeah. It's spoiled. That type of prosperity spoils the narcissist.
Right. Yeah.
So, yeah, these crimes we talk about on this show, they're never going to end.
That's true. We may not have economic abundance, Brian, but you know what we do have?
Love.
We have that, but we also have an abundance of murders to talk about. So
that is true. we will never run out of murders to talk about, ever.
Or crimes.
Or crimes.
So, do you have any more final thoughts before we wrap up?
Yes, as long as there's free choice, there will always be evil, there will always be crime.
Oh, well, my final thoughts is that sadly you are correct. And this is why I always encourage people to do the best they can in life and try not to, if you're going to commit crimes, don't commit a crime that will damage another person.
This is also why I encourage people to constantly be aware of their surroundings everywhere they go, no matter where you go. Be aware of your surroundings. You want to see that person who's a potential threat to you coming. You don't want to be surprised.
Right.
Okay. You don't want to all of a sudden hear somebody give you a command.
Right.
And then you turn and you're staring down a gun or a knife. No, you want to see that person coming in advance and avoid them.
Well, it's like when a few weeks ago, you remember, I'm going to tell a little story on this podcast, dear listeners. Brian, do you remember a few weeks ago when that guy followed me home from the gas station?
Yes.
Yeah, somebody followed me home from the gas station, and look, we live like just a block down from a gas station. And I went there the other night to go get something. And it's nighttime. And even though I always carry my phone with me, I don't look at my phone while I'm walking to the gas station. If you need a cough, go ahead. I don't look at my phone when I'm walking or anything like that. I do pay attention. And on the way back to the house, I could hear this guy, like, I could hear his footsteps. He wasn't really trying to be quiet at all. And I turned around, I confronted him because he had tried to get my attention earlier when I was at the gas station, but I ignored him because, I don't have to talk to you. And I could hear his footsteps. And then when I get to the house, he stops. And that's when I turned around and confronted him. I'm like, why are you following me to my house? I said, what do you want? And he tried to say that he knew my neighbor, but he couldn't tell me the neighbor's name. And I did have to wind up calling the cops because he was still outside my house an hour later.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember after you walked in, I had a brief discussion with him from the porch. And he said he was just going to chill out and wait for our neighbor to return. And I said, no, sir, that's not what you're going to do. You're going to leave very shortly, or you're going to risk going to jail. And he called my bluff, and I walked back inside, and then we called the police. And how many officers came to confront him and had a discussion with him?
At least 2. I didn't really go stick my face out there. I just, like, all that happened was that the officer knocked on the door, and he asked me to identify if that was the person who followed me back to the house. I said yes. And I said, I just want him to go away.
And then they had a discussion with him, and we could hear his voice over the police. He was yelling at the police and arguing with them, which, well, I mean, that wasn't very surprising because this guy wasn't very rational. Very likely he was mentally ill.
Or he might have been on drugs. That's
Yeah.
a possibility.
Yeah, another possibility. These are the types of people who they get into trouble all the time, and they don't think to simply say, "Oh, I'm sorry, officer. Okay, I'll be happy to leave. Have a nice evening," and walk away. They don't do that, because if they would do that, then they wouldn't. People like that wouldn't follow your wife home from a gas station,
anybody home,
or anybody.
Yeah, don't do that, dear listeners. Do not follow people home if you don't know them, please. Don't do that. It's really, really weird.
Yeah, somehow I don't think we have those kinds of listeners.
You never know who's listening. There could be a serial killer listening to this podcast at this very moment, which brings me into our teaser for next week. Because next week we are going to start a 2-part episode that involves a series of murders in the New Orleans area that left more questions than answers. We know that for sure there was one killer and probably a serial killer, but there is also the possibility that there was as many as 3 killers at the same time in the New Orleans area. So, dear listeners, with that, I'm going to tell you to be safe, be kind, and don't park next to vans.
And as always, if it's dark, if you don't feel it's safe, don't go there in the first place. And if you speak to law enforcement and it's not as the victim of a crime or witness to a crime, lawyer up.